Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I'm Rita McGrath, and my guest this week is Michael Schrage, a good friend, collaborator, co-worker, all kinds of things. His formal title is he's a research director at the MIT.
Research fellow. Occasionally I direct, but usually they just like me as a fellow.
He's a fellow at MIT. He's done some visiting scholarship work at Imperial College in London. We met years ago when we were both part of what were called the Wise People at Microsoft, where we helped them with the design of their annual CEO Summit. And you know, when Microsoft goes to an expert to learn about technology, you know that person's pretty sharp. And so that's how I first met Michael. Since then, he's an author. He's written a bunch of fabulous books. I have a couple of them here. The most recent one, Innovator's Hypothesis, which I love, How Cheap Experiments Are Worth More Than Good Ideas, and Recommendation Engines.
Oh, thank you.
But I think one of the ones you're most famous for is Serious Play.
Yes.
Concept of serious play, and he invented the term, and and maybe that's a great place to start. And then I'd love to get into the more prediction-oriented questions. But let's start talking about serious play. Why did you think of that, and where did it come from, and where is it now?
Well, where is it now? Probably remaindered on Amazon would be one of the immediate answers to that. The origins of serious play really go back to the first book, which was Shared Minds. And that was a book about collaboration. Collaboration in the sense of Watson and Crick, Braque and Picasso, Wilbur and Orville Wright, Marie and Pierre Curie. What made collaborations work? And because I had a technology background, I was particularly interested in collaborative tools and technologies. You know, Watson and Crick didn't do crap loads of experiments with DNA. They literally built metal models, to see how the helices, they went off of Rosalind Franklin's X-ray crystallography and Maurice Wilkins' work, and they built models on this. And the big takeaway from that book was that it takes, that collaboration was the process of not coordination, but shared creation. And the insight was it takes shared space to create shared discovery. So the properties of the shared space influenced and shaped the properties and the capabilities of the collaboration. And, the book did fairly well. I learned a lot. It was my first book. But then as I became even more involved and engaged in computers and software and did a fellowship at the Media Lab at MIT, I became more intrigued in the notion of how does digital shared space transform the properties and qualities of collaboration. And so serious play basically looked at the notion of what about simulations as the shared space, and just to foreshadow the subsequent book, experimenting with those simulations. So how did people engage? Because then you could have remote simulations, collaborative simulations. Suppose we change these variables. Suppose we change those variables. And so my tongue-in-cheek thing, because Nicholas Negroponte was the director of the Media Lab at that time, and he talked about the importance of moving from atoms to bits. The economics of manipulating bits was transformative relative to the economics of manipulating molecules and atoms. And so my tongue-in-cheek thing, and of course tongue-in-cheek will be a theme in this conversation, whether you like it or not, is I felt that simulations was the transition and transformation from bits to its. What's an it? Iteration. What did digital transformation enable? It transformed the economics of versions, of iterations. The number of iterations I could do per unit time was transformative. And now, of course, and I was not nearly clever enough to have anticipated this, but that's what you see with deep learning. That's what you see with transformers. That's what you see with auto encoding. All these machine learning capabilities are about, how do you capture features and iterate around them to learn? Gradient descent. So, but again, I wasn't that clever. My math wasn't that good. But the fundamental point remains the same. If you transform the economics of iteration, if you transform the economics of representation, if you transform the economics of how representations and iterations mash up, your ability to generate insights and discovery, your ability to test virtually in silico and in software hypotheses that matter, it's a different world. It's a different universe. And that kind of value prop, that kind of opportunity to collaboratively create new value, to toggle and pivot between human capital and iterative capital was really, really exciting to me. And that's pretty much been a theme of a lot of my research and a lot of my advisory work.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And one of the things that has always struck me about the way that you think is this ability to kind of look at where common wisdom sort of gives us the wrong answer. And, one of the things I've been very intrigued by is work as a place to go, and medicine as happening in a doctor's office, and all these things which really were functioned on the fact that there was this centralized scarce resource that people couldn't afford. So you had to go to a physical place where the plant was, or where the
Exactly.
MRI machine was, or whatever. And there's this fascinating kind of decentralization that I see. So as we look at healthcare, for example, there's a lot that had to be done in a doctor's office in a previous world that can now be done at home. So you can prick your own blood, you can get your own EKG, you can do your own migraine therapy, and
I'm not giving people the finger. I'm pointing to the Aura ring that I'm wearing.
What is that?
That's basically a quantified self. It monitors heartbeat, quality of sleep, number of steps. It's sort of like an Apple Watch, but with more of a health and physiological quantified self-focused. OURA. I'm not an advisor or a sponsor, but I'm just saying that that's a living example, a living digital example of what you're talking about. Yeah. By the way, just and not wishing to blow smoke or be too log rolling here, but that's part of the intrigue of our conversation, because you bring a discovery sensibility to this, and I think there's a very interesting pivot, and hinge point between where do we discover versus where do we create. Do we discover to create? Do we create to discover? Those are the sorts of things that I find quite interesting. When a smooth mirror has a curve or a warp, it has the power to magnify. So even a flaw literally allows you to see yourself or see things in a different way. So you have this very interesting twist between optics for discovery and optics for creation or seeing things in new ways. And so I think we bring complementary sensibilities to this discovery thing and the economics of discovery. I think that's one of the things that really distinguishes my work. And I think it's one of the reasons why business schools matter, because you really want to look at the practical aspects, the economics of discovery and the economics of innovation, not just discovery and innovation divorced from their cost structures or divorced from centralization, decentralization. I think that's a very big deal. Forgive me for going on longer, because I just mentioned business schools. One of the things that struck me, even when I was in college and reading research papers, I would read Science, I would read Nature, I would read the physics journal, the American Journal of Physics, in AIP. One of the things I always noticed was that they never showed you the budget for the experiments. They didn't tell you how much the experiments cost. They would sometimes tell you how long they took, but you didn't see the budget. And that always struck me, because I was an econ, computer science and economics. I was always struck that, actually economics mattered a lot. So I felt that was something being left out that mattered a lot. And so to connect that to your earlier point, a lot of common sense stuff goes away if you look at different parameters, or different constraints that have been assumed away. And economists are not innocent of that because, of course, what's the classic economics joke? Assume a can opener, you know. So I take the assumptions very, very seriously in all of this. Sorry for that long-winded answer, but I think people now have a very good background as to how I think about these things.
Yeah, it's great. It's so coincidental you said that, because just yesterday I was talking to a very, very senior person at a megalithic corporation who said, we invest in R&D, we invent all these products, we get them into our channels, we send them out into the retail world, and then we get bored with them. And if they don't take off like in a reasonably short time frame, we kind of get bored with them and they languish, and eventually we let them go. We have no idea what the total cost was of making that thing happen. And if we were smaller, and if our main business was less successful, if we were a tiny little company discovering this thing, we'd be all over it. We'd be so excited about it, which I thought was a very interesting reflection on the decision-making process as you begin to add resources to it.
But it's so true. I remember, I'll name the company. I was working with Procter and Gamble, and they were basically saying that it's not enough to create a new product. We have to create new categories. We have to grow the size of a Latin America marketplace, to satisfy our investors. So, everything hits diminishing returns at a certain point. And this is why so many organizations, this is why if you take markets and capitalism seriously, private equity is valuable, because you can take out that underappreciated, undervalued, but not underperforming business unit and structure it appropriately and give it the chance to grow, give it the chance to be freed from the overhead. I mean, I mentioned in college something that I hadn't really appreciated, did appreciate until I got into the real world. I didn't understand how overhead allocation could crush new business initiatives or ideas, simply how, and that's why organizations set up skunk works or, set off camps or different kind of things. So and what you inevitably and invariably discover, that culture matters, that there is this coevolution and clash between an organization's cultural imperatives and an organization's economic or financial imperatives. And sometimes they can be very healthy, and other times it basically literally ends up bankrupting the organization or making the firm financially successful, but with a culture that is sick, vile, vulgar, and everybody works there is unhappy.
And we've seen plenty of examples of that, right?
Right. And we're back to Daniel Bell, The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism,
So this may be a good time to bring up the concept of KPIs that you've been working on. So just for those who may not be familiar with the term, it means key performance indicators. And several, really gifted business leaders have emphasized just how important this is. Andy Grove comes to mind, right, with the whole notion of OKRs, right? John Doerr recently wrote a book about that.
Based on his time at Intel with Andy Grove.
With Andy, right, exactly. And you've basically taken a position recently in one of your MIT Sloan Management Review articles that, all this naysaying about KPIs just basically means you haven't done your homework.
Well, let me I'm sorry for giving such a long-winded thing on this, but let me tell you how I got into the KPIs. And let me tell you how, I'm not going to say that I became a convert, but I took them way more seriously than I thought I would. I surprised myself in that regard, because I like scenarios, I like narratives, I like strategic plans, I like that level of abstraction. But here's my situation. And this, I want to give my clients and my classes full marks on this, because I had the good fortune, and MIT is a good school, in its own ways, as good as Columbia,
I should just say for the audience, both of us do a lot of work in executive education.
Yes.
And Michael happens to do his at, a wonderful school based up north in Massachusetts. And I happen to do most of mine for a wonderful school based in New York. So there we go.
Absolutely. And we both bond making fun of the other school in Cambridge doing executive education. That's a story for another time. So, organizations, so I'm doing a lot of work in innovation. I'm doing work in digital transformation. Everybody's talking about big data. And so we'll stick with, I do work with innovation, and people basically say, well, how do we know how we're being innovative? How do we know? And then I'm doing the cloud and digital transformation. We have 10x, 100x, more, 1,000x more data. How do we know we're getting more value from data? And you know, you don't need to get a degree from university to realize these are measurement questions. What are we trying to measure? What unit of analysis makes the most sense in this regard? And so by sheer happenstance, I got into, and you know, I was working with this designing metrics, quite crude, because, and let me just say on the innovation side, why this was particularly irritating. Because I was working with a lot of organizations that were concerned about being more innovative, and literally 4 out of 5 times the metric they would point me to was an input metric. Altogether now, R&D spend. Well, look how much we're spending on R&D. I don't care what your input measure is. I can't, you know, I want the output. What's is it market share? But market share doesn't tell you how innovative it is. You know, so I was really forced to think through the fundamentals differently. Same thing with the data. You know, how do we know we're getting more value from data? Well, with data, it was a little bit easier because as computational power improved, we improved our analytics techniques. You know, we could do predictive analytics, we could do descriptive analytics, we could do predictive, prescriptive, descriptive, and we could do different kinds of learning on this, and so we could actually assess: did we do a good job of using analytics to convert that data into improved decision? Okay, so this was sort of key performance, improved decision, blah, 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 these sorts of things. So by happenstance, Google was interested in sponsoring some work on KPIs, because look what their big product was. Their big product was Google Analytics, the dashboard. What's the future of the dashboard? What's the future of the KPI? Here was Google's concern. Google's concern, because they absolutely do pay good attention to their customers, Google's concern was click-through rate. The overwhelming majority of their users were using the marketing funnel, the sales funnel, to improve CTR, click-through rate. But Google's not stupid. They know that's all tactical. They've had their own clickbait issues. They didn't want Google Analytics to facilitate clickbait conversions. How should we be thinking about these things? And so we're talking about, geez, what should KPI, customer lifetime value, look like? How do we provide a better balance between the marketing funnel, the sales funnel, click-through rate, and customer lifetime value? Is the lifetime a year, 2 years, a product cycle? And these were the issues that we were looking at. And, you know, there are 2 long story shorts here. One long story short is we found out that most organizations have KPIs that really aren't strategic. They're really about optimizing the function, optimizing the silo. So we did literally the largest global survey about how KPIs were used by senior management, and literally 26%, this is 3 years ago, only 26% of the people said their KPIs were aligned to the strategic goals of the firm. Oh my God, it's a KPI, not a PI, it's a KPI. So you had that disconnect. But here's the other one, which was really, really intriguing, and it creates the illusion of continuity in our conversation. What we discovered with the rise of machine learning is that originally, for years, we'll go back to the balanced scorecard, Eccles and the balanced scorecard.
You're giving me flashbacks.
Well, back to your thesis work, on building core competencies, but that KPIs were outputs of a process to help people make decisions, to help leaders make decisions, to help managers make decisions. But with machine learning, KPIs, key performance indicators, can become inputs to train machine learning algorithms. What do we want to optimize? We want to optimize these kinds of KPIs or KPI ensembles. So we have the transformation, again, this revolution from KPIs as outputs for humans to inputs for machines. And that's, That's a big deal. And that's one of the reasons why I bought into the notion of KPIs, because to the extent that it's not just how do we automate something, but how do we create platforms, how do we create products, how do we create services, how do we create experiences that continuously and continually learn, improve, and learn to improve. We need metrics for that. We need KPIs for that. Data is not our issue. Data is the differentiator. So how do we create a new alignment between greater quantities of data and greater quality of measurement and metrics? Again, long-winded story. I'm beginning to feel like we shouldn't get rid of the filibuster, because this ability to filibuster is so important, you know.
It could be your secret superpower.
Oh God, thank you. That would be, that's the sort of superpower that gets you invited to parties, isn't it?
Totally. So, I would always go to a party with you.
Oh,
your taste in champagne, as I recall.
That's the better. Yes, that's the real. My father, a true story. My father, who I loved, and I'm not saying that in a defensive way. My father had a wonderful saying that really powerfully influenced me my entire life. He said, and this began fairly young, not 5, but 7 or 8. He said, Michael, there are always 2 reasons for something: the good reason and the real reason. And I think that saying really did influence my push to try to identify the fundamentals of a situation as opposed to the good reason. In fairness, my dad said this before Herb Simon articulated the philosophy of satisficing versus optimizing. So that is sadly a big insight into the character deformations I possess.
So we've had a question about why you wear the ring. What do you do with that data?
That's an excellent question. So I wear the ring. I'll be very serious. Since the pandemic, I have sleeping issues. Part of it, I'm in California and I'm more of an East Coast person, and I'm talking with people all the time. But I felt I needed a way to see what my equilibrium looked like. I'm looking for the anomalies. I'm looking for the variance. If I have sleep scores in the 60s, goes up to 100. If I have sleep scores in the 60s 3 nights in a row, I'm going to throttle back. I pretty much want my sleep score to be above 80. If I'm not doing there's a physical activity thing, it's a gamification thing. But I want to be clear, I'm not a slave to this, but it's we're back to behavioral economics. It's sort of a nudge for me. It's a context center. I want context setter. I want information, performance information that gives me context for decision about how I feel about myself, my energy management. I have, and we can talk about this, obviously, I'm very interested in the subject of selves-aware, technology that augments and enhances or alternately mitigates or ameliorates aspects of oneself to become more productive, to become more effective in one's own eyes and the eyes and minds of one's colleagues and collaborators. So I'm very interested in the notion of the self, because number one, it's human capital and it's who we are. The other is increasingly who we are is defined by the technology we use, and to be cynical about it, the technology that uses us. Shoshana Zuboff's phrase, surveillance economy, didn't catch on by accident. It's because it has a resonance that makes sense. I'm not as cynical to believe that, if you don't know what the product is, you're the product. The flip side is, I wrote a book on recommender systems, network effects. You are contributing. Everybody who touches Google or touches Amazon or touches Spotify, thank you. Any person, any individual, any family, any self that touches a born digital platform, is I'm not going to say is being manipulated, but is part of an ecosystem, both as a recipient and as a contributor. And I think the majority of people probably are not aware. We talk about, you mentioned healthcare, informed consent. I would say the majority of people really don't know how much they contribute to the value of the platforms with which they choose to engage. Mm-hmm. It's a big deal. Mm-hmm. It's a big deal. I think informed consent is going to be one of the biggest policy and personal issues for the next decade. I think it's at the root of privacy. I think it's at the root of healthcare. It's different if you're in mainland China, of course, but I think it's a big deal.
Oh, I would totally agree. In fact, the first chapter of my most recent book talks about the fact that if people were aware of what Facebook does with that baby picture, for example, there'd be a lot less eagerness to participate. And I think it's interesting, the recent kerfuffle between Facebook and Apple. Right. Over all Apple wanted to do was insert a little question that says, "Do we have your permission?" And Facebook went ballistic, which I think is interesting.
That's why I would verbally edit you, because I think it's more than a kerfuffle. I actually think that's going to be one of the fault lines. And not that I want to veer too much into quote unquote ethical conversations, but the notion of how can you make people legitimately feel empowered rather than compromised when they're sharing those pictures, when they're sharing those aspects of themselves. I think that's, when we talk about purpose and leadership and purpose for organizations, I think that's a big deal. I think it is not a good thing that Facebook, where my brother worked for a number of years, that Facebook has not adequately addressed that. I think it's not good that Google hasn't adequately addressed that. I think it's going to be coming to Amazon as it seeks to expand. TikTok is going to be an interesting special case given where it's based. Alibaba, these are already issues. I mean, you remember that wonderful line from Bruce Sterling, the science fiction writer, "The future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed." Well, it's becoming a heck of a lot more evenly distributed. Mm-hmm. And we're beginning to have to live with the consequences of that. And that's why I care so much about how do we empower people with recommendations and collaboration to have agency, to take more charge of themselves, or at least have greater selves awareness going forward.
It's a really interesting topic. And, earlier we were talking about the gap between this orthodoxy, which was back, tech was going to be the great leveler, right?
Right.
To some extent it is. I mean, if you look at it, a teenager with a cell phone, right, can become an Instagram star and do things that 30 years ago would have required a major television studio to do, or MG or the News Corp or something. And so today, some of that has actually been democratized. But what I'm thinking about, you're making me think about, is that maybe is just a surface level cover for the fact that the great centralization are these massive server farms and these massive data repositories and these massive things that you actually now have to, when you talk about going to work, you've got to go to them now, right? And I don't know if that's clear, but this notion of distribution only gets you so far.
There are a number of issues there. I want to deal first with the notion that everybody has a cell phone and the democratization. I had a colleague at MIT, Eric von Hippel, user-generated innovation. We did a couple of pieces together, and he wrote a very good book on democratizing innovation. But I want to make what I think is a logical but obvious point. Mm-hmm. You're right that a teenager, we'll get rid of the Kardashians for the moment, can become a TikTok or Instagram star or influencer. But democratization does not mean greater equitability of outcome. No. It means greater distribution of opportunity. So in fact, you're increasing the variance in this regard. Now, in terms of infrastructure, I'm old enough to remember when AT&T was a monopoly and published the Bell System Journal of Economics. And the one academic idiosyncrasy of the Bell Systems Journal of Economics was that there was such a thing as a natural monopoly. Is there a natural network oligopoly on these things? I don't know. But there's no question that there is, Pache Scott Galloway, there is some sort of a oligopoly in regards to platforms. The whole notion of get big fast which is fraught with risk. It turns out to be, if you can get big fast, it's a big honking deal. It's a big honking deal. And if we look at the world's richest people, they are people who got big fast, not who they didn't pick their parents well. They got big fast. So, I think that's a very, very interesting domain. I do believe we're going to be seeing more innovative forms of regulation, but I'm going to double down on what I said to you earlier. Mm-hmm. If you were to ask me, if I had time with the EU or the Federal Trade Commission, the FCC, smart regulators. I'm going to keep Congress separate from that for the moment, but really, regulators who are serious, and professional organizations who I hope retain professional norms and standards. I would really be doubling down on what do we want, not just informed consent to mean, but what's an informed consent experience. Okay. I'm an adult. I think I can make these decisions for myself, but perhaps I need advice on this. Maybe I need recommendations on this, the counterpart of a Better Business Bureau. So how do we become, because we're all overwhelmed with choice, how do we become better informed about consent? The revolution that you and I lived through, and I mean this very, very seriously, because people don't think of it as a revolution, but it is. It was profound. And it was the point you raised on healthcare. When you and I were born, you went to your doctor, you trusted your doctor. Getting a second opinion was considered oftentimes to be a breach of trust. You were forced to do so oftentimes by the insurer because the insurer wanted to have context for these things. Now, that's a very crude example. But it's had enormous repercussions. What's the third opinion? And now, do these things get reviewed by artificial intelligence? Maybe a Watson shouldn't have been about prescribing. Maybe it should have been about reviewing. We can talk about these things. But the whole notion of how do you empower? How do you use technology to empower, not just to impose? I think is a really interesting debate. And one that I think we're going to have more and more of in our business schools, not just in our divinity schools or in our law schools.
I absolutely agree. In healthcare specifically, one of the examples that struck me very vividly was it was the dean of the University of Utah, I believe it was, a hospital system, did this heretical thing. She says, I want to know how much stuff costs that we do in the hospital. And this provoked a horrified response, right? But she stuck to her guns. And what they found was once you knew what stuff cost, you could actually start to see where the variances were in what cost and where the exceptions were, and why did one doctor run up bills of $200,000 per procedure and another doctor ran up bills of $20,000 for the same thing, and once you had that information, you could actually now start to make smarter decisions. And so what you're talking about takes that on steroids.
But exactly. Notice that it connects to the science papers. We don't know what the budgets were, but the others. Remember, there was the perfectly ethical reason. We don't want the cost of a procedure to interfere with what a doctor recommends. So the irony of your point there is, and the dean's point is, that informed consent cuts both ways. Mm-hmm. It's as much for the provider as for the recipient. And now we're talking about questions of transparency and visibility. And I think these become more important. And now, ironically, 20 years ago, you couldn't do these things. But now with auras, with laptops, with digital instrumentation, the ability to have greater transparency and visibility and algorithms that can help you interpret and learn or predict variances and anomalies, that's a big deal. I think we've just begun our journey in that regard. But I think precisely because we're just beginning this journey, we need more serious conversations about transparency, visibility, informed consent, hard dollar versus opportunity cost. Sadly, although not for me, sadly, economics becomes even more important in this kind of environment. Understanding trade-offs becomes more important in this environment. Helping people helping individuals, helping families, helping business leaders, helping managers understand trade-offs, visualizing trade-offs becomes that much more important. And that's something I'm very excited about. I think that's, and by the way, measuring trade-offs, key performance, and what are the trade-offs? Those are the ingredients, those are the tools for insight.
Mm-hmm.
You know, again, this is your work on discovery. This is what you're, this is why we're compliments. This is, I think, very much been a theme of your work as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So one of the questions that I've been intrigued by, and one of my colleagues at Columbia at the Center for Teleinformation wrote a paper, now we're going back years, who predicted basically that information democracy would cause the dispersal of the university. And, you know, both of us, I think one of the interesting things about executive education in business schools to me is that's where a lot of innovation is allowed to happen, because it's not really the core business. It's sort of, you can try stuff over there and it's, you know, it's not going to worry our brand. And, you know, if you want to experiment, okay, whatever. And yet, you know, if I think about the core brands, you know, the main business of the business schools, the degree granting parts of it. I had an interesting conversation a few months ago with somebody, and I said, well, you know, why would it be worth it to somebody to spend $250,000 on a Columbia degree, let's just say? And they start off with, oh, you know, the network and the people that you meet and the job of the admissions office, right? I mean, my joke on this is we only take like 1 out of 18 people, and they're super people, right? They're, you know, they climb mountains in Nepal, they jump out of airplanes, they sing arias in the opera. I mean, they're super people. All we have to do is no damage in the 2 years that we have them. They're going to be super people when they graduate. And so, you know, eventually you get to sort of item number 22 by the time you say, oh yeah, they might learn something. And I think one of the very interesting observations I would make, and I don't know where this is going to land, but in the pandemic, right? We've learned that the knowledge transmission function of the university is a small fraction in many cases of its value, and that knowledge transmission function can be done in a lot of other ways.
Well, I completely agree. I have, you know, full disclosure, you know, I mentioned my dad and his story. I'm a faculty brat, you know, from Chicago's Hyde Park. Again, that explains pretty much 80% of my dysfunction, but that's a comment best left to the chat. I agree completely with you on that, but I want to double down on this because I'm a little skeptical about quote unquote the future of the university. We're all living longer. I think education for people in their 40s is now more important than education for people in their 20s. Yes, I'm biased because I'm closer to my 40s than I am to my 20s. Then again, you know, if you don't have a continuous learning ethos, you're going to have an issue no matter what your grades from Columbia or MIT or Harvard are, you know, in the year 2024. But the key insight that I come away with, and this ties directly into your, forgive me for doing this to you, but to your doctoral thesis. You know, when I began at MIT, you know, I really thought about education as being the transmission of expertise. How can I use myself, my colleagues, my tools, the class to more efficiently, effectively, comprehensively, personalized, you know, transmit my expertise? And fortunately, because I'm at MIT and our motto is mens et manus, you know, mind and hands, I realized, and spent time at the Media Lab, that I realized, and I'm embarrassed to say that it took me longer to realize. I wish it was an instantaneous epiphany, but it wasn't. It was, you know, yeah, I was a moron. It's not primarily the transmission of expertise. It's the cultivation of capability. And you know, I think one of the things we learn from being on Zoom or, you know, Teams is that communicating information and sharing knowledge really is tactically and practically different than how do you cultivate a capability in someone, you know? And this, you should talk about your thesis now, because this is, you know, it's the whole notion of, it's not just how you know something, it's your ability to enact what you know in a way that adds value cost effectively. You know, that's talk about optimization within constraints. That's not subtle. That's hard. That's hard, and that's where I think we need to go. And I think that's why technology is so important, because a lot of our capabilities increasingly come from our ability to engage and interact with our technology as well. Rita was making sure that I put my name correctly on the Zoom. I would consider it a minor feature, but it's part of the capability of effective telepresence.
Well,
so
and I love that. I love the cultivation of capability idea. And so
I would just urge people to consider that. I think people need to think about, as managers, are you doing a better job of transmitting expertise or cultivating capability? I think I've seen but that's what you do.
Uh-huh. Well, so just on the dissertation, for people that don't know about it, I followed project teams. And what I was interested in was the development of capability. How did they get better at doing what they did? And so it was a survey-based thing, but in a move that you'll appreciate this, Michael, all of my advisors strongly advised against, it was longitudinal. So I followed them over time because what I was interested in was how do you detect the emergence of capability? And found a model that basically said it begins with understanding what's causing what. So that's the discovery process. So, if I push this lever over here, what happens over there? Then building human teams that could build on that. And then we measure increasing capability, increasing competence by how much of what I intended to happen actually happened. Some of that is distinctive. Some of that is distinctive in a way customers care about. And then ultimately a definition of competitive advantage, which said, you've got advantage in the market, so people want to buy your stuff. You've got advantage in the company, which is not correlated very strongly at all with what the market wants. And then you've got some kind of defense against competition. And what was cool about it, I think, and I should do more with it really now that I'm thinking about it, is we could measure every step along that way. We actually have—
I was going to mention that if you didn't bring it up, yes.
We do. We can measure it. We can absolutely measure it. And I'm thinking this could be the beginning of a beautiful friendship, Michael, because that instrument, it exists. It's been tested. It's been published in all the right academic places. And, I think maybe now that would be something people would really embrace more.
This is the thing, because you were doing this and you were doing it, if you'll forgive the use of the A word, in the analog days.
Yes.
It was a Wharton. But now, what I think, talk about undervalued assets. There are a lot of, pun intended, instruments, measures, metrics that if you repurpose them in digital contexts, instrumenting things every moment rather than end of day or every week or every month or, God forbid, every quarter, you really would get different insights into this. But again, the reason why I mentioned that was not just to suck up, but to point out that this was not that you define these things not as these groups becoming more expert. No. It's competent and competence around dimensions of value differentiation, not just conformance to requirements or delivering to a spec. These are not subtle distinctions. This is why you have to address the fundamentals on this.
So let's go back to this interesting conversation about the increasing distance, if you will. It's like when you look at tech and companies that use it well versus tech and companies that don't use it well, it's like watching one of those horse races where the leaders break away from the pack, or watching the New York Marathon, where the first runners come by and then about 3 hours later, the massive pack comes along. And I begin to wonder sometimes if that's beginning to show itself in competitive dynamics.
Oh, I don't think it's beginning. I think it's pretty clear. I think that's the situation. But before we opened up, Rita and I were talking about that. When I remember being at a Sloan Foundation Future of Global Productivity thing back when, who was the guy who was at IBM? Head of he was the president. Ralph Gomery. Ralph Gomery was the president of the Sloan Foundation, and he was funding these things. A wonderful guy, looked like a Gene Wilder. Great guy. And basically the economists, some of whom won Nobels or had won Nobels, Paul Romer wasn't a part of that crowd in that time. Basically, the argument was that as these tools diffused, we were going to see a global convergence in productivity. Asia is more productive here, US, but ultimately with the diffusion of these tools, we're going to see a convergence of productivity. And I would argue, and I think that Rita and I were just talking about this, that actually what we've seen with the quote unquote democratization and the diffusion of all of these technologies, we've actually seen greater skew, greater variance on this. The rich are getting richer, and the people in the middle, it's the worst situation. It's the worst Red Queen situation, without attempting to be gender oriented here, is that you have to run harder just to stay in place. And let's face it, if you're not digitally competent, let's put aside digitally savvy. I mean, look at the stress. Here's Satya Nadella saying that we've compressed 5 years of digital transformation in 6 months. Okay, well, there are been a lot of casualties of those who weren't able to compress 5 years of digital transformation in 6 months. And if you doubt me, walk down the streets of any urban area and you will see. And so size and scale mattered a lot. Ghost kitchens have sprung up, as opposed to your corner restaurant, unless the corner restaurant is able to be a part of a ghost kitchen or, network, Uberize the kitchens in that way. And by the way, who's the guy who launched a big cloud kitchen thing? It was Travis Kalanick of Uber, So these different economics changed things. So I really do, in my policy hat, which is a very small hat, I really am curious about what the impacts of this kind of variance is going to be, because the median, there's never been a worse time to be average. There's never been a worse time to be mediocre, because nobody's going to pay you a premium to be good enough. Nobody's going to pay a premium to be average. You may be able to make a living, but that's what you'll be able to make, a living, because you need to. We're back to your thesis. Is there a distinctive competency or capability that allows you to command something above the median in compensation? I think that's a really, really interesting question. It's why people talk about UBI, universal basic income. I'm curious. I'm very curious about that. My best clients, my best students are the ones who are the most interested in creating new value, not the ones who want to do what they're doing faster, better, cheaper. That's one of the ways my students and my clients have really split. And the ones who are just interested in doing good enough, they don't even bother coming to class. So,
right. Especially if it's remote.
Yeah, exactly.
No, they're not.
I mean, by the way, Rita and I are saying this kind of ruefully. There's no joy in it. This is a hard issue. And the pandemic. Remember the famous Warren Buffett line that you don't see you swimming naked until the tide goes out? Well, you don't see who's not capable of coping with change until a global pandemic. Once a century global pandemic. Some companies didn't just have done better than others; they've done remarkably better than others. Remarkably better.
It's been so interesting to see the split. And the companies on the right side of that curve, unbelievable. I mean, one of my clients is a woman who works for Benjamin Moore Paints. She's like, we can't keep paint on the shelf. Like we're opening up plants like faster than we've ever had to in our entire lives. And then I have another client that runs a chain of dry cleaners. Well, nobody's going to the office. There's no, their weddings are downscaled.
What do you do? Do you this is the kind of, and I've done a little bit. Do you say that we clean linens and stuff, that we use this to make your home more viral? The things that, I want to be fair on this. For a lot of these, I have no clue. I like to think of myself as a clever guy and, who can always be useful. But, you do realize you're, for want of a better phrase, impotence and ignorance in the face of a true VUCA event on this.
Well, I mean, one of the great things has been, I don't have to make the case for change anymore. And I don't have to explain to people how uncertain situations are really different from situations where you know a lot more, because everybody is now in a level of uncertainty that has, in my experience, never been paralleled. And one of the more interesting things, I think, Michael, and I think this is where our work really converges in a big way, is that the tools of innovation, the tools of experimentation, the tools of the digital world to come are exactly the tools that you need, that you'll be relying on to dig your way out of whatever this is. But here's the interesting but. I talked to so many, even very senior leaders at very well-known firms, the P&Gs and Monsantos of the world. And there are a number of people in that hierarchical level who have never bumped up against innovation in any way. They're operators, and they operate safely, and it's an incredibly important skill. They, you don't want workforce experimentation when you're mid-flight on an airplane, right? But they have no idea. And so what I think is almost a positive discovery on their part is that these tools actually exist, and they've been well documented in terrific books like this, the experimentation book, and we know how to do this. And yet a lot of people are way behind on that learning curve, I think.
You're absolutely correct, and I'm going to double down on digital in this regard. And actually, now that I said it, it's sort of a pun. You're absolutely right. There's certain kinds of experiments you don't want to do mid-flight, and many of these people are quote unquote operators, and that's a conversation for another time. And maybe we'll do that with other folks. But what I have begun to observe, and you will see this as a sort of a mashup of the recommender book, the experimenter book, and the shared minds, the serious playbook on simulation. The rise of digital twins allows you to play with alternative possibilities. Well, this is what we did, but suppose we had changed these variables. Suppose we had focused on these SKUs or this turnaround time or inventory management approach differently. So the ability to create digital twins, digital copies, digital versions, not just of documents and factories, but of teams and customer interactions, dramatically reduces your cost of experimentation and learning. And will the next culture of operators think in terms of how do I fine tune or challenge my assumptions in a digital context versus a real world context, IRL context? So that's going to be the tension, IRL versus digital. I think that's going to be, to mix a metaphor, a camel's nose under the tent for getting operators to explore quote unquote innovative approaches. But like you, I see that those are the issues that I see. My one, forgive me for going on this, my one financial twist on this is organizations that are capital intensive, that are asset intensive, they take these modeling things seriously because they're constantly trying to boost return on assets. And it's expensive to do that, back to Nicholas Negroponte and Adams, so you want to test it in bits. So I actually think organizations that figure out how to do digital twins, that's going to be one of those things that promote further variance and skew in marketplaces.
That's really interesting. So, well, goodness, this time is flying by. Do you have any advice or things you hope people listening to this would take on or explore next?
Well, I really, the advice I'll quote my dad, again, just make sure that you really are addressing, it's like what your doctoral thesis, addressing real reasons, not good reasons. The other is, and this is, yes, I will say one provocative thing from the book, from the Innovator's Hypothesis book. Ideas have a great brand. Everybody wants to come up with good ideas, and there was a pushback, which, execution versus ideas. But if you were to ask me the one thing I've done with organizations, the one semantic trick, the stupid human semantic trick I've done with organizations that has really had an impact on innovation, culture, investment, internal debate, it's you say to people, don't come to me with good ideas, come to me with testable hypotheses. I want you, no matter how good of an idea you have, I want you to come to me with that idea and a testable hypothesis. that we can do a, with apologies to Popper, a falsifiable, experiment on. Ideally an A/B experiment, not necessarily a multivariate one, because we have these networks. You talked about R&D earlier, research and development. I talk about E&S, experiment and scale. Networks make it easy to experiment and scale. But what is the seed? What is the scaffold? What is the framework? What is the organizing and operating principle for a good experiment? It's a good hypothesis. Not a good idea, a good hypothesis. And, this is a good way to end. Rita, your book says the same thing. I discovered that's the, we are, it's not just complements, we intersect on this issue. That is, are you really rigorously thinking through the business hypotheses around value creation that are worth testing and worth learning from?
And then that turns into a metric.
Thank you. Yes. Yes.
It does at the end of the day. Well, this has been fabulous. We've let it go far too long before having these conversations. So I'm glad we were able to invite a few of our friends in to do that. For those whose questions we didn't get to in the chat, we'll follow up afterwards. We capture them.
That'd be great.
We'll follow up. Yeah, and I'll send you the copies of the chat so we can, to be continued. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I love the fireplace in the back on this. This is the painting that my wife procured of a dancer. It's lovely. So that's it. I think that's going to be the next big AI program is drawing inferences from people's backgrounds so that you can engage with them better.
There you go.
I'm funding that in the Valley. I'll let you know how that goes.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody. Have a lovely weekend. Bye-bye.